In the mid-1980s, a local farmer walking the limestone pavement of the Burren in County Clare, Ireland, noticed something wrong with one of the most photographed monuments in the entire country. Polnabrone Dolmen, a portal tomb consisting of two tall standing stones holding up a massive 13-foot capstone, had stood on that exposed, windswept plateau for something like 5,800 years without anyone seriously worrying about its structural integrity. But by the early 1980s, a crack running through the base of one of the eastern portal stones had grown wide enough that archaeologists monitoring the site concluded the whole monument was at real risk of collapse. That crisis is what triggered a full excavation, something nobody had planned to do purely out of curiosity. Archaeologist Anne Lynch led the dig in 1986, with a follow-up season in 1988, going into the ground specifically to stabilize a monument that was quite literally falling apart, and coming out the other side with one of the most important collections of Neolithic human remains ever recovered in Ireland. Underneath and around that heavy stone roof, Lynch's team found the disarticulated, scattered bones of at least 33 individuals, men, women, and children, mixed in with stone axes, bone and quartz, crystal jewelry, weapons, and pottery. Radiocarbon dating placed the burials across a roughly 600-year window, somewhere between 3800 and 3200 BC, which means the oldest material sitting inside that tomb is pushing close to 6,000 years old. Nobody involved in that repair job expected the crumbling monument they'd been sent to. Shore Up would eventually become one of the central case studies in a genetic re-examination of the deepest layer of Irish history. But decades later, when modern ancient DNA techniques finally caught up to what was sitting in those bones, Polnabrone and a handful of sites like it delivered a set of findings that upended almost everything Ireland thought it knew about where its earliest people actually came from, who they really were beneath the skin, and how thoroughly the population living there today is disconnected from the very first farmers who raised these stones. The first serious hurdle facing anyone trying to pull DNA out of 6,000-year-old Irish bone is the same hurdle that haunts almost every attempt at ancient DNA work anywhere in the world, and that's simple decay. DNA is a fragile molecule, and left exposed to heat, moisture, and the ordinary churn of bacteria and fungi in normal soil, it degrades into unreadable fragments within a matter of centuries in most environments, sometimes faster. Ireland's climate, cool, damp, and geologically varied, isn't automatically hostile to preservation the way a tropical rainforest would be, but it isn't automatically friendly either. What actually made large-scale ancient Irish genome sequencing possible wasn't some special property of Irish soil. It was a shift in where researchers decided to look inside the skeleton itself. Rather than targeting long bones or ribs, the kind of material early forensic and archaeological genetics traditionally worked with, geneticists increasingly turned to the petrous bone, an extremely dense enough to be nicknamed the hardest bone in the human body. Structure that forms part of the skull surrounding the inner ear. Because of its unusual density and its protected location deep inside the cranium, the petrous bone traps and preserves far more genetic material than almost any other part of the skeleton, and it does it for far longer. Once researchers started routinely sampling from the single, previously overlooked structure, the amount of usable ancient DNA recoverable from a given skeleton jumped enormously, sometimes by a factor of 100 compared to standard bone samples. That technical shift is a big part of why so much of what we now know about ancient Ireland only came to light in the last decade, even though many of these skeletons had been sitting in museum storage, fully excavated and cataloged for years, or even decades before anyone managed to read what was actually locked inside them. The first full ancient Irish genome ever sequenced didn't come from Polnabrone at all. It came from a skull excavated more than a century and a half earlier in 1855, from a passage tomb chamber at Ballinahaddy, near Belfast, during quarrying work that stumbled onto the site by accident. That skull sat in museum collections for generations, always studied on and off by successive waves of archaeologists using whatever techniques their era offered, until a team led by geneticist Dan Bradley and archaeologist Laura Cassidy at Trinity College Dublin finally sequenced her full genome in 2015 and published the results in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The woman, who researchers estimated lived around 3200 BC, close to 5,200 years ago, had died in her mid-20s. And her genome came back carrying a set of surprises that immediately complicated the tidy folk image of what an ancient Irish person was supposed to look like. Her DNA indicated black hair and brown eyes, and her genetic ancestry traced most closely, not to anyone living in Ireland today, but to modern populations in Spain and Sardinia. Researchers reconstructed her likely facial appearance based on that genetic data, and gave the reconstruction the working nickname Ava, and the resulting image looked far more Mediterranean than anything most people would instinctively associate with prehistoric Ireland. that single genome, confirmed something researchers had suspected but never been able to directly demonstrate, that farming didn't simply spread into Ireland as an idea, passed along by trade and cultural contact between static populations. It arrived as people, an actual wave of migrants whose ancestors had left the Fertile Crescent thousands of years earlier and moved slowly across Anatolia into the Mediterranean, and eventually all the way out to the edge of the known world, carrying wheat, barley, and domesticated animals with them the entire way, and in the process, largely swamping or replacing the genetic legacy of Ireland's earlier hunter-gatherer population, whose own presence on the island stretched back further still into the Mesolithic. Polnabrone, once its remains finally got the same genomic treatment roughly 3 decades after that emergency 1986 excavation, filled in a huge amount of texture around that same migration story. Because unlike a single isolated skull, it offered researchers dozens of individuals from one community buried across generations, all preserved together in one location. Genetic analysis confirmed what the tomb's construction date already suggested, that the people interred there belonged to the same wave of incoming farming populations responsible for Ballinahaddy's Ava, genetically affiliated with Neolithic Britain and further back with continental Europe, arriving in Dáin Asum, Ireland from at least as early as 3800 BC and essentially erasing the genetic signature of Ireland's indigenous Mesolithic hunter-gatherers within a handful of generations. That kind of near-total population replacement, rather than a slow blending of newcomers and locals, turned out to be a genuinely important and somewhat unsettling finding, because it meant Ireland's transition from hunting and foraging to farming wasn't the same people simply changing their lifestyle. It was, in genetic terms, largely one population being pushed out or absorbed into statistical insignificance by another. There is at least one documented exception worth noting, evidence from a site called Parknabinia in County Clare showing some genuine intermixing between indigenous and incoming populations as late as 3750 to 3500 BC, suggesting the replacement wasn't perfectly total or instantaneous everywhere, but the overall pattern across the island points overwhelmingly towards substitution rather than gradual cultural adoption. Buried among the more expected findings from Polnabrone's dozens of skeletons was something nobody excavating a crumbling Bronze Age monument in the 1980s could possibly have anticipated finding, because the technology to even look for it didn't exist yet. Among the remains recovered from the tomb was a 6-month-old infant, and when Laura Cassidy's team at Trinity College Dublin finally sequenced that child's genome as part of a much larger 2020 study, the results showed 3 copies of chromosome 21 rather than the usual 2, the genetic signature of Down syndrome. It is, as far as researchers can currently determine, the oldest confirmed case of Down syndrome ever identified anywhere in the human genetic record, predating every other documented example by a wide margin. Cassidy described the finding in interviews afterward as offering a small, genuinely moving glimpse into how this specific Neolithic community treated a member of the group who would have needed real, sustained care, since the infant had been buried within the same monumental tomb structure as everyone else in the community, given the same ritual treatment in death as any other member of the group. It's a detail that quietly humanizes an entire population that, for most of the 20th century, existed in the popular imagination as little more than the anonymous builders of large stone monuments, faceless figures known only through the scale of what they left behind, rather than through anything about their actual lived experience, their families, or how they treated the most vulnerable people among them. Quick pause here, because if the kind of story where an emergency repair job on a crumbling monument accidentally opens up an entirely new genetic window into a 6,000-year-old community is exactly the sort of thing that keeps you coming back to channels like this one, that's precisely the territory we keep digging into. If that's useful to you, go ahead and subscribe. It genuinely helps more of this research reach more people. The most dramatic single finding to come out of ancient Irish genetics, though, didn't come from Polnabrone or from Ballinahaddy. It came from Ireland's most famous prehistoric monument of all, Newgrange, the enormous circular passage tomb in County Meath that predates both Stonehenge and the pyramids of Giza and is famous worldwide for the narrow roof box above its entrance that allows a beam of sunlight to travel the full length of its inner passage on the morning of the winter solstice, and only then. Newgrange had been excavated across the 1960s and 1970s, and deep inside the monument, in a small, elaborately carved recess, considered the most decorated and most prominent chamber in the entire structure, excavators had found the unburnt bones of a single adult man, catalogued simply as NG10. In 2020, as part of the same wave of research that identified the Polnabrone Down syndrome case, Laura Cassidy's team at Trinity College Dublin extracted and sequenced NG10's genome from his petrous bone, and what they found made international headlines within days of publication in the journal Nature. NG10's genome showed unmistakable, unambiguous evidence of first-degree incest. His parents had either been full siblings or a parent and their own child, a level of inbreeding so extreme it produces a genetic signature that's essentially impossible to mistake for anything else. Socially sanctioned matings this close are exceptionally rare across all of human history and ethnography, and where they have been documented at all, it's almost always within a very narrow, specific social context. Ruling dynasties, specifically polygynous, patrilineal royal families, headed by figures the researchers described using the specific term god kings, the kind of arrangement historically associated with ancient Egyptian pharaohs, the Inca ruling elite, and royal lineages in ancient Hawaii. All cultures that broke the otherwise near universal human taboo against incest specifically to concentrate and preserve a bloodline understood as divine or exceptional. Finding that same genetic signature in a man buried in the single most elaborately decorated chamber of Ireland's most monumental Neolithic structure led Cassidy and her co-authors to propose something genuinely startling, that a hereditary dynastic ruling elite, one willing to break humanity's most consistent social taboo to preserve a bloodline, had existed in Ireland more than 1,000 years earlier than most historians had previously assumed any form of concentrated political power existed on the island. The Newgrange findings didn't stop with that one striking genome. Cassidy's team also identified genetic relatives of NG10 buried at two entirely separate megalithic complexes, roughly 150 kilometers to the west, at Carrowmore and Carrowkeel in County Sligo, along with a connection to a monument at Millen Bay in County Down, suggesting that whatever social network this individual belonged to stretched across enormous distances for a small-scale prehistoric society, hundreds of miles of difficult terrain, linking distinct, geographically separated megalithic complexes through what appears to be an actual extended family. Queen's University Belfast archaeologist Eileen Murphy, a co-author on the study, described the connection at the time as genuinely remarkable evidence of widespread and enduring social ties, stretching across a landscape that, on the surface, looks like a collection of separate, unrelated monument clusters. For a population usually imagined as a loose scattering of small, roughly egalitarian, farming communities, evidence of a bloodline elite maintaining ties across that kind of distance, and apparently important enough to warrant incestuous union specifically to protect its lineage, suggested a degree of social stratification and centralized authority that simply hadn't shown up anywhere else in Ireland's prehistoric record before. That dramatic reading of the evidence held as the dominant interpretation for roughly 5 years, and then, more recently, it ran into serious pushback. A team led by researcher Neil Carlin published a study in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal in April of 2025, reanalyzing DNA from 55 skeletons recovered from Ireland's Neolithic passage tombs, and their conclusions cut directly against the dynastic elite narrative that had made headlines back in 2020. Most of the individuals buried across these enormous, elaborately built monuments they found weren't closely related to each other at all, undermining the idea that the tombs functioned primarily as the resting places of a single extended ruling family. And a separate 2025 study, led by researchers including Penny Bickle, went further still, specifically re-examining the circumstances around NG10 himself. Because the individuals interred inside passage tombs like Newgrange were so frequently disarticulated, broken down, mixed together with cremated remains, and apparently moved around within the monument across the many centuries, it remained in active use. Bickle's team argued there's no real way to be confident the people who eventually placed the NG10 fragment inside Newgrange's most decorated chamber actually knew who his parents were, or understood anything about the specific circumstances of his conception at the time they buried him there. Bickle pointed out that the tomb itself grew and changed in stages over a very long span of time, meaning it's not even clear NG10 was originally buried at Newgrange at all, as opposed to being moved there from somewhere else, entirely at some later point. Rather than proof of a ruling dynasty actively practicing incest to preserve a sacred bloodline, the newer interpretation treats NG10's parentage as something closer to an isolated, unusual biological event, one that later generations may have reinterpreted as significant without necessarily understanding or caring about its actual genetic origin. As it currently stands, researchers now describe the incestuous origins of NG10 as a genuine outlier, a one-off finding, when set against the much larger body of DNA data now available from Neolithic Ireland as a whole, rather than the tip of a broader pattern of elite inbreeding. It's a genuinely useful example of how ancient DNA research doesn't always deliver a single, permanent answer the moment a genome gets sequenced. Sometimes, the first dramatic headline turns out to be only the opening chapter of a much longer, more careful argument that keeps evolving as more data and more skeptical eyes get applied to it. While Ireland's Neolithic farmers were busy building these enormous monuments, their genetic story was already quietly setting up its next major disruption, one that would prove even more thorough than the population turnover that had originally replaced the island's Mesolithic hunter-gatherers in the first place. Around 1,000 years after Ava's community at Ballinahattie were laying out their dead, and roughly overlapping with the tail end of activity at monuments like Newgrange and Polnabrone, a second wave of migration began reaching Ireland's shores. This time, the newcomers weren't tracing their roots back to the eastern Mediterranean and the origins of agriculture. Their genetic origins lay far to the northeast, in the Pontic steppe, the vast grassland stretching across what's now Ukraine and southern Russia, home to the pastoralist populations whose Bronze Age migrations reshaped the genetic makeup of enormous stretches of Europe within a remarkably short window of time. Evidence for exactly how thoroughly this second wave transformed Ireland came from a cyst burial on tiny Rathlin Island, a spit of land off Ireland. As northeast coast with a total modern population of roughly 150 people, where archaeologists recovered the remains of 3 Bronze Age men who lived around 2000 BC, roughly 4,000 years ago. When Dan Bradley and Laura Cassidy's team sequenced their genomes as part of that same landmark 2015 study that first revealed Ava, the results showed something dramatic. Roughly a third of these men's genetic ancestry traced directly back to those steppe pastoralist populations, a level of genetic replacement steep enough that researchers described it as evidence of an actual population turnover layered directly on top of the earlier Neolithic farmer population, rather than simple cultural influence or trade contact. Within roughly 1,000 years, in other words, Ireland's population had already been substantially replaced once by incoming farmers from the Mediterranean, and was now being substantially replaced a second time by a completely different wave of migrants whose roots lay in the grasslands of Eastern Europe. That second wave of migration left an outsized, still visible mark on the population of Ireland today, in ways considerably more immediate than facial reconstructions and burial patterns. The 3 Rathlin Island men and the wider Bronze Age population they represented showed the strongest genetic affinity researchers found in this entire body of work to modern populations in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, a much closer match than anything found in the earlier Neolithic farmer genomes, suggesting the central genetic attributes of what we'd now recognize as the modern insular Celtic population were established around this exact horizon, roughly 4,000 years ago, rather than during the earlier farming migration that built the Great Passage tombs. And it's specifically in this Bronze Age layer that some of Ireland's most distinctive modern genetic traits first show up in the ancient record. The Rathlin men carried the most common Irish Y chromosome type, the R1b haplotype still overwhelmingly dominant among Irish men today, along with genetic variants associated with blue eyes and with the ability to digest lactose into adulthood, a trait that offers a clear survival advantage in a population that had, by this point, committed heavily to dairy farming. Most strikingly of all, one of the Rathlin men carried the C282Y mutation associated with hereditary hemochromatosis, a disorder that causes the body to absorb and retain excessive amounts of iron from food, eventually damaging the liver, heart, and joints if left untreated. Ireland today has the highest frequency of this specific mutation found anywhere on Earth, common enough among people of Irish descent that clinicians and researchers sometimes informally refer to it as the Celtic disease, and researchers involved in the study describe this finding as, to their knowledge, the very first detection of a known Mendelian genetic disease variant recovered directly from prehistoric human remains anywhere in the world. A disorder that still quietly shapes the medical reality of hundreds of thousands of people of Irish descent today, one requiring lifelong monitoring and periodic blood removal to manage, was already circulating in the population 4,000 years ago, likely because the same mutation that causes iron overload in a modern iron-rich diet may once have offered some protective advantage against iron-poor diets or specific infections in the ancient world, a trade-off that made evolutionary sense in the Bronze Age and has simply outlived the conditions that originally favored it. Put all of these threads together, and what emerges is a genuinely uncomfortable, genuinely fascinating correction to almost everything the popular imagination assumes about deep Irish identity. The people who raised Polnabrone's capstone, who buried Ava at Ballinahattie, who built and decorated the passage at Newgrange with enough skill and astronomical precision to align its inner chamber with the winter solstice sunrise down to the minute, weren't the direct, unbroken genetic ancestors of the people living in Ireland today in anything like the simple, continuous sense most national origin stories like to imagine. They were dark-haired, brown-eyed farmers whose own roots traced back through Britain and continental Europe to the eastern Mediterranean, a population that itself had already almost entirely replaced an earlier population of Irish hunter-gatherers whose genetic signature is now vanishingly rare in anyone alive today. And that farming population was, in turn, substantially replaced again within roughly 1,000 years by an entirely different wave of migrants from the Pontic steppe. whose genetic legacy actually does closely match the population living in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales right now. Modern Irish ancestry, in other words, doesn't trace back in one continuous, unbroken line to the people who built the country's most famous prehistoric monuments. It traces most directly to whoever arrived roughly 1,000 years after those monuments were already ancient, bringing with them cattle, bronze tools, a completely different set of genetic traits, and, unknowingly, a scattering of mutations that would go on to define some of the most distinctively Irish medical and genetic realities that persist today. None of this diminishes what Ireland's Neolithic population actually built, or what their remains have managed to reveal once modern genetic science finally caught up to what was buried in their bones. If anything, it adds a layer of genuine complexity that the older, simpler story never had room for. A community capable of raising and precisely aligning a monument like Newgrange, a monument whose builders somehow calculated a solar alignment so exact it still functions perfectly more than 5,000 years later, was also a community that buried a child with Down syndrome inside its most sacred communal structure alongside everyone else without apparent distinction. A society whose most decorated tomb chamber held the remains of a man born of first-degree incest was also, according to the most recent and more careful reanalysis of that same evidence, probably not the incestuous royal dynasty the initial dramatic headlines suggested, but something closer to an ordinary farming community that happened to produce one deeply unusual individual whose biological origins may not have meant anything special to the people who eventually buried him, and the population responsible for all of it was itself living on borrowed time, genetically speaking, destined within a relatively short span of prehistoric centuries to be substantially replaced by an entirely different wave of migrants whose own genetic legacy is the one that actually persists, quietly, inside millions of people, walking around Ireland, Scotland, and Wales today, most of whom have never heard the words Ballinahaddy, Polnabrone, or Rathlin Island in their lives. What DNA extracted from a crumbling 6,000-year-old tomb in the Burren, and from a skull pulled out of a Belfast quarry in 1855, and from 3 men buried on a tiny island off Ireland's northeast coast, actually managed to do wasn't confirm a simple, comforting story about unbroken ancestral continuity stretching back to the builders of Ireland's most famous monuments. It replaced that story with something far stranger and considerably more honest. A layered, repeatedly disrupted population history in which almost every group of people who ever called this island home was eventually swamped, absorbed, or genetically overwritten by the next wave of arrivals, right up until the version of Irish ancestry that actually persists into the present day. And the questions these findings opened haven't fully closed either. Researchers are still working through exactly how thorough that Bronze Age replacement really was in different regions of the island, still debating precisely how socially significant NG10's parentage actually was to the people who buried him, and still, with every new genome pulled from every newly re-examined skeleton, finding fresh evidence that the deep story of who actually built ancient Ireland and who its people actually descended from is considerably more tangled, more surprising, and more human than any single tidy national origin story ever managed to capture on its own. If you're interested in seeing how this same kind of population replacement story, ancient migrations quietly erasing and rewriting entire genetic populations, has played out at other prehistoric sites around the world, there are other breakdowns on this channel digging into exactly that. Let us know in the comments what struck you most here. The fact that Ireland's most iconic monument builders aren't the direct ancestors of most people living in Ireland today. The 6-month-old with Down syndrome buried inside a 6,000-year-old tomb, or the fact that a crack in a single stone almost caused this entire genetic story to collapse before anyone even started digging. See you in the next one.